Chapter 1. The Reflection That Watched. The first time Daniel noticed the reflection watching him, he assumed it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The antique mirror, a towering relic framed in blackened silver, had been in his late grandfather's house for decades. It stood against the far wall of the study, its surface so polished that it captured every detail of the dimly lit room. That night, as he sat at the old wooden desk, flipping through his grandfather's handwritten journal, something in the reflection caught his eye. A movement, too subtle, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. Daniel froze. He turned his head slightly to glance at the mirror directly. Nothing seemed out of place. The bookshelves, the oil lamp, the dusty velvet curtains swayed faintly with the evening breeze. Yet, when he looked back at the mirror, his reflection wasn't mirroring him exactly. His heart pounded. He leaned forward, studying the glass with wide eyes. His reflection mimicked the movement, but there was a lag, a fraction of a second too slow. Then it blinked. Daniel hadn't blinked. A shiver ran down his spine. He pushed back from the desk, breathing unevenly. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. He swept the beam across the room, reassuring himself that nothing had changed, nothing had moved. But in the mirror, his reflection remained frozen in place, watching him. His pulse roared in his ears. It was impossible. He took a shaky step forward, his own breath visible in the cold air. And then, in the silence, his reflection smiled. Daniel stumbled backward, knocking the oil lamp from the desk. The glass shattered against the wooden floor, and for the briefest moment, the flickering light caught the edge of the mirror's surface, revealing something else standing behind his reflection. A second figure, pale, hollow-eyed, waiting. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Mirror. Daniel couldn't shake the image from his mind, the reflection that lingered too long, the second figure that had been there just for a moment. It was impossible, he told himself, a trick of the light, a side effect of exhaustion. And yet, the thought gnawed at him. The next morning he stood before the mirror once more. In the daylight it looked ordinary, though its silver frame bore strange engravings he hadn't noticed before. They twisted like curling vines, intricate and sharp. He reached out, tracing his fingers over the metal. The surface was unnaturally cold. His grandfather had always kept this mirror covered. Daniel remembered that now. A heavy black sheet had draped over it for as long as he could recall. As a child, he had assumed it was just another of his grandfather's odd habits, like the locked study door or the rows of dusty tomes that no one was allowed to touch. Now, standing in the morning light, Daniel realized his grandfather had been hiding something. Determined, he searched the study, pulling open drawers and cabinets, flipping through aged notebooks filled with cryptic handwritten notes. The more he read, the colder the room seemed to become. Then, at the bottom of an old wooden chest, he found a small, leather-bound journal. The last entry sent a chill through his spine. The mirror does not forget. It does not forgive. I should never have uncovered it. Beneath the scrawled words, a rough sketch of the mirror stared back at him, and standing in the reflection was a figure with no face. Chapter 3. The man in the glass. Daniel stared at the mirror, heart pounding. He had spent the entire morning trying to convince himself that what he saw last night was just a hallucination, a trick of the dim light and his exhausted mind. But now, in the bright glow of the afternoon sun, the mirror still felt wrong. It wasn't just the faint delay in his reflection, or the unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from the silver frame. It was the sense that something watched him from beyond the glass. He could feel it, a presence just out of sight, lurking in the reflective depths. Swallowing hard, Daniel took a deep breath and lifted his phone. He opened the camera and held it up to the mirror. The reflection showed exactly what it should. The study, the bookshelves, the window with the golden light streaming through, and him. But then, a movement. Daniel hadn't moved, yet something in the reflection had. His stomach twisted as he zoomed in, his hands trembling. The longer he stared, the more he noticed. The reflection of himself was subtly different. The expression was slightly off. The eyes seemed darker, deeper. The corners of his lips tugged up in a barely perceptible smirk. His real face was neutral. His reflection was smiling. Daniel's grip tightened on his phone. The air in the study grew heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. He turned his head slightly to test the image. The reflection did not follow. It stayed still. Panic surged through him as he stumbled back, his phone slipping from his grasp. The screen cracked as it hit the wooden floor, but Daniel barely registered the sound. Because in the mirror, his reflection had begun to move on its own. It raised its hand, slowly, deliberately. The smile widened, stretching too far, too unnaturally, and then, in a voice that was his but not his, the reflection spoke. "Let me out." Chapter 4. Whispers in the Silver. Daniel stood before the mirror, his breath slow and measured, though his heart pounded violently against his ribs. The room was silent. Yet he could hear something, a faint whispering, threading through the air like a distant conversation. He turned sharply, scanning the study. Empty. The whispering persisted. His gaze fell back on the mirror. His reflection stood just as it should, mirroring his every move. But the whispering came from the glass itself, as if something deep within the silver surface was calling to him. His hands clenched into fists. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The response was almost immediate. A shudder ran through the mirror's surface as though the glass had rippled like disturbed water. And then, words formed, not aloud, but inside his head. "Let me in." Daniel recoiled, his stomach twisted violently, but he forced himself to stay rooted to the spot. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices now, some pleading, some laughing, some murmuring in tones too familiar to be strangers. Then his reflection did something that made his blood turn ice cold. It leaned closer, not in the way a normal reflection would when he moved, but on its own, independently. The whispering stopped. The room plunged into an eerie silence, and then the reflection pressed its hand against the glass. Daniel took a step back, but the reflection remained forward, its palm now flat against the surface, as though pressing against an invisible barrier. and then a second hand appeared beside it. Daniel's breath caught. The second hand did not belong to his reflection. Something else was in the mirror. Watching. Wait. Chapter 5. The first sign. Daniel's world felt unsteady, as if the very air around him had thickened with something unseen. The whispers had faded, but their presence lingered in his mind like a haunting echo. He avoided the mirror for the next few days, forcing himself to believe that if he ignored it, whatever lurked within would fade away. But the first sign that it wouldn't was small, subtle enough that he almost missed it. It started with his reflection behaving normally again. He tested it, moving slowly in front of the glass, raising his hand, blinking deliberately. This time his reflection mirrored him perfectly. No delay, no unnatural smiles, but something still felt off. Then, on the third night as he sat at his grandfather's desk reading through more of the old journal entries, he glanced at the mirror absent-mindedly. That's when he noticed it. The reflection of the desk drawer was slightly ajar. In real life, the drawer was closed. Daniel's blood ran cold. His breath hitched as he slowly turned toward the actual desk. The drawer remained tightly shut, just as it had been all night. His eyes darted back to the mirror. In the reflection, the drawer creaked open. A shaky breath left his lips as he watched it move, slowly, deliberately, as if an unseen hand were pulling it open from inside the glass. Then something shifted inside the drawer. Something dark. A deep, scratching sound resonated through the room, coming not from the real drawer, but from inside the mirror. Daniel scrambled away from the desk, his pulse pounding so hard he could barely hear anything else. The journal pages fluttered as he knocked against the desk, his chair tipping over with a crash. But in the mirror, his reflection remained seated, still unmoving. And then, it slowly turned its head toward him and smiled. Chapter 6. Shadows behind the glass. Daniel refused to look at the mirror, yet he felt its presence, like an open doorway behind him. Even when he closed his eyes, he could sense something shifting beyond the glass, something waiting. The study was cold, unnaturally so, as though the room itself had been drained of warmth. Then came the shadows. At first, they were subtle, flickers at the edges of his vision, just beyond the reflection, the kind of movement one might dismiss as a trick of the light. But when he turned to look, there was nothing. Only the deep silver surface of the mirror and his own wary face staring back at him. But the shadows were growing bolder. One night, as he sat at the desk, pretending to read while avoiding the mirror, something moved. Not his reflection. Not a mere flicker. A dark figure passed behind him. Daniel's breath hitched. He twisted in his chair, heart hammering. The study was empty. Yet in the mirror, the figure had not disappeared. It stood in the far corner of the reflection. Tall, still, watching. His stomach twisted. His hands trembled against the wooden desk. His reflection mirrored his fear, but the figure remained separate, unattached to him. A presence that should not exist. The light in the room flickered. A whisper. Low, distorted, threaded through the silence. You let it see you. Daniel gasped and bolted up, knocking over the chair. His pulse roared in his ears as he forced himself to not look at the mirror, to not acknowledge whatever had crawled its way into the reflection. But his eyes betrayed him, and what he saw in the glass made his blood turn to ice. The figure was no longer standing in the corner. It was right behind him. Chapter 7. The Face That Wasn't Mine. Daniel stood frozen before the mirror, his breath shallow, his fingers curled into trembling fists. The reflection staring back at him was familiar. His dark eyes, the sharp angles of his jaw, the faint scar on his left cheek. But something was wrong. It wasn't his face. Not exactly. The differences were subtle but undeniable. The eyes slightly wider, the pupils darker, more hollow. The mouth too, still, as if it had forgotten how to breathe. The skin paler than it should be, almost waxen. Daniel swallowed hard, taking a cautious step closer. His reflection mimicked him, but there was an unnatural lag, a hesitation that sent a chill down his spine. He raised his hand. Slowly, the reflection did the same, but an instant too late. His heart pounded. The mirror was watching him, not reflecting him. Then, the reflection smiled. Daniel hadn't smiled. A sharp breath caught in his throat as he stumbled back, knocking into the desk behind him. His reflection remained where it was, head tilted slightly, its grin growing wider, more unnatural. Then it spoke, not aloud, inside his head. "You look just like me, but I was here first." The whisper was smooth, confident, his own voice, but distorted, wrong. Daniel's stomach twisted. His legs screamed for him to run, but he couldn't move, couldn't break away from the thing in the mirror. The longer he looked, the more he felt himself slipping, as if his own reflection was pulling him in. Then, the lights flickered, and the reflection moved, without him. Chapter 8. The Mirror's Warning. Daniel's body was stiff with fear. He tried to move, but the weight of the air around him felt wrong, heavy, as if unseen hands pressed against his shoulders, keeping him in place. The mirror rippled, distorting the image inside it like water disturbed by an invisible force. His reflection still stood there, grinning, waiting. Then it spoke again. "You should not have stayed." The words slithered through his mind, not carried by sound, but by something deeper, something that bypassed his ears and went straight into his thoughts. His hands clenched at his sides as his pulse thundered. The reflection's smile faltered. It was subtle, but Daniel saw it, a flicker of something else behind the grin, fear. The mirror shook. A hairline crack splintered across the surface, the noise like distant thunder in a storm that hadn't yet arrived. The air turned frigid, his breath visible in the dim glow of the room's lone lamp. Then, from deep within the mirror, something moved. A second shape, a dark figure lurking just beyond the glass, growing clearer by the second. The reflection turned its head sharply, not to mimic Daniel, but to look at the thing behind it. Daniel's chest tightened. If his reflection was afraid, then what was inside the mirror was worse. A whisper crept through the crack in the glass. "Do not let it out." Chapter 9. When the Glass Cracked. A sharp, splintering sound echoed through the room as the hairline crack in the mirror deepened. Daniel staggered backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. The fracture spiderwebbed across the surface, distorting his reflection into a grotesque puzzle of jagged pieces. And then the whispering began. It wasn't just a single voice anymore. It was a chorus, rising from within the mirror, their words overlapping, tangled, growing louder with each passing second. Some begged, others laughed, and a few, the worst ones, hissed his name with twisted delight. Daniel, Daniel, let us out. His body tensed as he watched the mirror breathe, the glass warping like something inside was pushing against it. The room around him flickered. The walls seemed further away, the air growing heavier, pressing down on his chest. Then the reflection moved again. Daniel didn't move, but in the shattered reflection, his reflection lifted a hand, slowly reaching toward the glass. Its fingers, his fingers, pressed against the cracks, the skin too smooth, too perfect, like porcelain. The mirror trembled under its touch, the fracture glowing faintly as if awakening. And then it reached through. A hand, identical to Daniel's but not his, burst from the glass with a shattering explosion. Jagged shards rained to the floor, but the hand kept coming, fingers curling as it reached for him, nails blackened and cracked. The skin shimmered like something not quite human. Daniel couldn't breathe. He turned to run, but the whispering surged, their voices twisting into something resembling laughter. The mirror wasn't breaking, opening, and something inside it was coming through. Chapter 10. The Other Side. Daniel barely had time to react as the mirror pulled him in. The moment the shattered glass gave way, he felt himself falling, weightless yet sinking, as though being dragged through water that wasn't really there. Cold tendrils wrapped around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His screams never made a sound. Then, impact. He hit the ground hard, gasping as icy air filled his lungs. He was no longer in his study. No bookshelves, no warm lamplight, just a vast, endless void stretching in every direction. The sky, if it could even be called that, was a shifting mass of gray mist, swirling like smoke trapped inside glass. And then he saw it. The mirror. But it was no longer cracked. It stood upright in the middle of the endless space, pristine, its silver surface reflecting something wrong. His study was there in the reflection, but it wasn't empty. A figure stood on the other side where he had been just moments ago. It was him. Daniel's stomach twisted in horror as he watched his reflection reach forward, placing its hand against the glass. He scrambled to his feet, rushing toward the mirror, pounding on its surface. No, let me out. The reflection only smiled. Slowly, deliberately, it raised a single finger to its lips, signaling for silence. Then, without breaking its gaze, the reflection turned and walked away, leaving Daniel trapped inside the mirror's endless void. The whispering returned, louder than before. You are on the other side now. Chapter 11. The reflection that moved first. Daniel stood frozen before the mirror, his breath shallow, his fingers clenched into fists. The room was eerily silent, but he could feel it. The subtle, unnatural shift in the air. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. It moved first. He hadn't twitched a muscle, yet the figure in the glass had. A blink too soon, a tilt of the head before he even thought of turning. The realization sent ice through his veins. Then it smiled. Daniel staggered back. No. This isn't real. But the reflection didn't speak. It watched. A whisper curled through the air, though the reflection's lips never moved. It was inside his mind, threading into his thoughts, familiar yet wrong. You should have never looked too long. The glass rippled like disturbed water. The reflection took a step forward, except it wasn't in the mirror anymore. The room shifted, warping at the edges, stretching into something unrecognizable. The desk, the bookshelves, even the window blurred into the void. Daniel turned to run, but the door was gone. There was only the mirror, and the thing inside it was stepping out. Your turn. Chapter 12. The Echo of the Dead. Daniel's scream barely escaped his lips before the mirror swallowed the sound. The figure that had once been his reflection stood before him, solid, real, and grinning. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, and the room around him darkened as though the world itself were folding inward. Then came the echoes. Low murmurs at first, faint, indistinct. They curled around his ears like a forgotten memory, familiar yet impossible. The words came in fragmented whispers, voices he recognized but knew should not exist. Daniel, it's so cold. He knew that voice. His mother's. His breath caught in his throat. She had been gone for years. He had buried her, grieved for her. Yet her voice, fragile, lost, was here. He turned, desperate to find the source, but the study was gone. In its place stretched an infinite abyss of shattered reflections, fragments of mirrors floating like broken glass suspended in darkness. Within each shard, figures moved, some standing, some reaching, some watching. They were trapped. Daniel, help me. The voice whispered again. His mother's reflection flickered in one of the shards, her eyes hollow, her hands pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. He staggered forward, hands trembling. A breathless laugh curled through the space, soft at first, then mocking. The figure that had stepped from the mirror, his false reflection, tilted its head. They all say that, it murmured. At first, Daniel's stomach twisted with dread as the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chorus of the dead. We remember you. We see you. You should never have come. Then, in unison, hundreds of hands pressed against the mirrors. The glass shattered, and the dead came through. Chapter 13. The Room of No Exit. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the shards of broken glass dissolved into shadow. The space around him twisted, warping into an unfamiliar room, one with no doors, no windows, just endless smooth black walls that seemed to stretch infinitely. He wasn't in the study anymore. The whispers had ceased, but the silence was worse, a suffocating void of sound pressing against his skull, thick with something unspoken. He spun in place, searching for a way out, for anything that wasn't this impossible prison. Then he saw them, the mirrors. They lined the walls, tall, ancient things, their silver surfaces rippling like water, and within them figures shifted, not reflections, not shadows. People, faces twisted in expressions of terror, some screaming soundlessly, others frozen in place as if they had been caught mid-plea. Daniel's pulse thundered as he stepped closer to the nearest mirror. A man inside it slammed his hands against the glass, his mouth moving frantically. But there was no sound. The mirrors were cages. His stomach twisted as he turned from one to the next, each surface revealing someone different. Trapped, waiting. Some were people he didn't recognize, but others were familiar. He stopped cold. His own face stared back at him from one of the mirrors, but it wasn't his reflection. It was him, mirroring his every movement in perfect sync. Except this version of him had no eyes. A cold shudder crawled down his spine as his reflection slowly raised a hand and pointed behind him. Daniel turned and saw that he was no longer alone. Chapter 14. The Last Look. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he turned, his body stiff with terror. The room was silent, too silent. His pulse pounded in his ears as he scanned the darkened space, searching for what had changed. Then he saw it. The mirrors had shifted. No longer were they simple reflections of himself or the others trapped within. Now they all faced him. Dozens of identical Daniels stared back, their expressions cold, hollow, wrong. Some had sunken eyes, others had twisted, distorted features, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. Then one moved. Not a flicker, not a trick of the light, it stepped forward. The glass rippled as the figure in the nearest mirror walked through, its body peeling away from the silver surface like a shadow unsticking from the ground. Daniel staggered backward, but the figure kept coming, its footsteps silent, gliding toward him with a slow, measured grace. Then another stepped out, and another. The mirror prison had opened. Daniel turned, searching for an escape, but there was no door, no break in the endless walls of glass. The room had sealed itself, trapping him in a shifting maze of endless reflections, each one breaking free, each one becoming real. Then one of them spoke. "Only one of us leaves." The whisper echoed around him, distorted, layered, as if spoken by all the figures at once. Daniel's chest tightened as they closed in, their bodies flickering like mirages, glitching as if reality itself was unraveling. He pressed himself against the last remaining intact mirror, his own reflection staring back at him, wide-eyed, terrified, still trapped within the glass. His real reflection, the only real one. And in that moment, he knew they were trying to replace him. The first imposter lunged. Chapter 15. The man who wasn't there. Daniel's vision blurred as the imposters lunged, their movements fractured like a film reel skipping frames. He braced himself for impact, but it never came. Instead, the figures stopped inches from him, their distorted faces stretching into impossible grins. Then, one by one, they began to vanish. Not disappearing, not fading, erasing. The room itself trembled, the glass warping as though reality itself was breaking apart. The reflections flickered, some lingering longer than others, reluctant to leave. And then, silence. Daniel found himself alone. The shifting maze of mirrors had dissolved, leaving him in an empty, endless void. The air was cold, hollow, formless. And then he saw himself, not in a mirror, not in a reflection, just standing there, an exact copy of him. But there was something off. The man before him lacked a shadow, his presence unnatural, like an image slightly out of focus. "Who are you?" Daniel's voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper. The man smiled, an expression devoid of warmth. "The one who stays." Daniel's heart pounded. He took a step back. The man took a step forward. "You don't belong here anymore," the figure continued. "You never did." Daniel turned, frantically searching for a way out, but there was nothing, just blackness. The figure reached out, fingers brushing Daniel's shoulder. And in that moment, everything collapsed. A sharp, deafening noise filled the void, like shattering glass and howling wind merging into one. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, and then silence again. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in his study. The mirror was gone. The room was intact, as if nothing had ever happened. His breath came in ragged gasps. He turned toward the window, expecting to see the familiar nightscape outside. Instead, he saw himself. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, but as he moved, it did not. And then it smiled,